I want to respond to two worries which have been expressed by Lynne Baker, who was part of our project and who sadly died over Christmas. Two worries which have been expressed by Lynne Baker and John Cottingham, and which have an important bearing upon the expansive naturalist position I seek to defend. Lynne's thought, articulated in her paper for our preliminary workshop, is that if any form of naturalism is true, whether scientific or expansive, then there is nothing outside the natural world. This means, and I'm quoting from her paper, that reality stops with the mundane and nothing is transcendent. John's thought, articulated in an email exchange, is that on my position, I've got to deny that there is anything external or transcendent, whereas he wants to say, quotes, even after discarding silly ideas of another place or a destination where we will be issued with harps or pitchforks, we still need something external. John then refers to the radical immanentism of my own position, distinguishing it from his own commitment to a kind of divine externality. Now, my own position's a form of naturalism, an expansive naturalism which I have argued can accommodate God. I take this to mean that it can accommodate the transcendent. Yet, if Lynne is right that nothing is transcendent on the naturalist picture, then we have a justification for John's claim that I'm committed to radical immanentism and that radical immanentism excludes God, assuming that God requires reference to the transcendent. Everything hangs on the question of how we're to comprehend the transcendent, and in what follows, I just want to begin to spell this out a bit in hardly any detail, to respond to the relevant worries about my own position and to press the question of what the distinction is between my position and John's. So this is section 2, expansive naturalism and God. The naturalist denies that there is anything beyond nature. The typical naturalist does. And it's a common enough refrain amongst naturalists that this world is the only world there is. Thus, John Herman Randall, writing in 1944, claims that naturalism can be defined negatively as, quotes, the refusal to take nature or the natural as a term of distinction. Nature, he continues, has become the all-inclusive category. Now, in Randall's hands, this is a reductive claim, for he takes the limits of nature to be defined by science. I reject scientific naturalism and must therefore allow that there is something beyond nature in this sense, i.e., that there is something beyond nature as comprehended and measured by science. I'm on the side of many philosophers in this respect, and here I'm just listing the people in our project: John Cottingham, Akhil Bilgrami, Mario De Caro, David MacArthur, Charles Tulliver, Keith Ward, John McDowell, who was not in the project, James Griffin, Hilary Putnam, and anybody else who takes scientific naturalism to be an ideological prejudice. I make clear in my book, God, Value and Nature, that this commits all of us to a form of supernaturalism. At least it does if supernatural is understood to be the logical complement of natural in the scientific sense. So we're all rejecting scientific naturalism, and we're committed therefore to allowing that there's more to nature than what can be comprehended by science, and I'm saying that that commits us to a form of supernaturalism, provided that the natural in supernatural is understood scientifically. A further theme of God, Value and Nature is that the terms at issue here are unclear and porous, and parche what the typical atheist thinks, of little use in settling the theist-atheist debate for precisely this reason. Supernaturalism in the non-scientistic sense I've just described does not involve a commitment to a two-worlds position, and could do so only on the scientific assumption that the scientist has a monopoly on the natural world, because then if you limit the natural world in those terms, you have to postulate another world or another realm to make sense of all of the things that are missing in that way of thinking about the world. So supernaturalism does not involve a commitment to a two worlds position. Rather, it's equivalent to a form of expansive naturalism. Expansive in the sense that the limits of the natural world have been expanded beyond scientific parameters. Expansive naturalism grants one the right to think of nature as, and I'm quoting here from Griffin, who is an expansive naturalist, nature as the ordinary world around us, mainly the world of humans and animals and happenings in their lives. That's how Griffin puts it. And it allows us to say that the natural world is rich enough to accommodate phenomena which cannot be wholly comprehended in scientific terms. For example, value. As Griffin puts it, values do not need any world except the ordinary world around us. Quotes, "An otherworldly realm of value just produces unnecessary problems about what it could possibly be and how we could learn about it." And they're standard sort of objections to Moorian-style realism, moral realism. You know, there's an epistemological problem, how can we gain knowledge to these supposedly non-natural properties? And there's a metaphysical problem, how are they to be understood and how do they relate to the ordinary world? I've said already that the expansive naturalist is a supernaturalist from the point of view of the scientific naturalist. It's unsurprising then that the values she posits are treated as otherworldly and unnecessarily problematic from the standpoint of the scientific naturalist. So the scientific naturalist thinks that anything is spooky that goes beyond the limits of nature as he or she understands it. So these things are unnecessarily problematic from the standpoint of the scientific naturalist. They count as such because the scientific naturalist thinks that she has already said everything that needs to be said about value. Anything else, i.e. anything that takes us beyond science, involves unnecessary cosmic excess. The expansive naturalist can respond that the notion here of an unnecessary cosmic excess is relative to one's philosophical commitments. If one accepts the truth of scientism, then anything which challenges this truth will count as excessive. By contrast, if scientism is rejected, then this restriction will seem excessive. Now, talk of unnecessary cosmic excess is relevant to the question of God, because God is an unnecessary cosmic excess from the standpoint of the atheist, of which the scientific naturalist is one, and the typical expansive naturalist another. According to this way of thinking, the way of thinking which tells us that it's cosmically excessive to bring God into the picture, according to this way of thinking, the theist distinguishes between nature and God, but the second term of this distinction is superfluous because nature can be wholly comprehended in non-theistic terms. That is to say, there is nothing beyond nature and nothing transcendent in this sense. The implication here is that the atheist settles for nature and a theist adds something wholly unnecessary and deeply problematic, namely God. Or the atheist denies that there is anything transcendent, whereas the theist commits to this ontological addition. I reject this conjunctive framework. In doing so, I'm in the company of many philosophers and theologians within the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's rejected most forcibly, this framework, by Hegel in his Encyclopaedia Logic, and you've got the quotation I'm going to read in a minute on your sheet. It's rejected most forcibly by Hegel in his Encyclopaedia Logic when he objects to a dualism, quotes, which makes the opposition of finite and infinite insuperable, and in which, quotes, the infinite itself is also just one of the two. For Hegel, then, the question of transcendence and its relation to immanence is transformed into the question of the relation between the infinite and the finite. He accepts the traditional view that God's infinite. And the following passage, which you've got, spells out the difficulty he foresees when the infinite, God, is viewed in the offending separatist terms. Quote, It is therefore reduced to one particular, in addition to which the finite is the other one, it being the infinite. In this relationship where one is situated here and the other one over there, the finite in this world and the infinite in the other world, an equal dignity of subsistence and independence is attributed to the finite and to the infinite. The being of the finite is made into an absolute being. In this dualism, it stands solidly on its own feet. There is supposed to be an abyss, an impassable gulf between the two. The infinite has to remain absolutely on the other side and the finite on this side. Now, if God and nature are opposed in this manner, then God is reduced to a particular, to be housed in the other world. This means that God can no longer be described as infinite. To be infinite is to be unbounded. Nature is divorced from God, and God and nature become components within a more comprehensive reality. As Herbert McCabe puts it, God and the world are made to add up to two, as if they're on the same ontological level. It means also that being an atheist is simply a matter of rejecting this ontological addition, a tempting move if one thinks it's superfluous. A rejection of this addition leaves us with immanentism in John's atheistic radical sense, although the atheist would deny that it leaves us with no way of accommodating value. So, section 3 now, transcendence and immanence. So, with this as a background, I just want to say a little more about my own understanding of the notion of transcendence as it figures within an expansive naturalist framework, albeit with the caveat that there are limits upon what can be said with precision in this context, given that we're talking about God. First, my position is to be distinguished from what John calls radical immanentism, equals atheistic immanentism, because the natural world, as I understand it, involves God. It involves God in a sense that would be acceptable to John, and when I originally gave this paper, he was sitting next to me. So in a sense that would be acceptable to John, for I grant with him that there are intimations or traces of God to be found in the natural world, and that they are manifest, for example, here's a quote from John, in the compelling power of our moral sensibilities. Now, John's worry about my position is that I've got to deny that there is anything external or transcendent, whereas he wants to say that, quote, even after discarding silly ideas of another place or a destination where we'll be issued with harps or pitchforks, we still need a kind of divine externality. This suggests that John agrees with me that God is not externally related to the world in the way that things within the world are spatially related, but he thinks that an expansive naturalist position cannot accommodate divine externality. That is to say, John thinks that on my position, God is reducible to the world. Now, I do not want to say that God is reducible to the world, but I, as I've said, reject a conjunctive conception of this relationship. Equals God and the world do not add up to two, in the way that they would if we were concerned with two things within a more comprehensive reality. Rather, I want to say that God is radically distinct from anything within or beyond the world, quote, not a part of the world and not a kind of being at all, as Robert Sokolowski has put it, or Brad S. Gregory in a brilliant paper, quote, neither outside nor inside his creation, wholly present to everything in the natural world, precisely because he is altogether inconceivable in spatial categories. I'm not denying these are difficult claims and that we're up against the limits of language in this context. What is unclear to me is why it should be thought that God poses a particular difficulty for my position, as opposed to someone of John's persuasion, and I'm interested to see how the differences between our positions are to be spelled out. The name Spinoza comes to mind at this point, and I can imagine John saying that I'm a pantheist, whereas he's a theist. Now, I'm wholly unclear how to characterize the difference between pantheism and theism, at least so far as someone like Spinoza is concerned. But here's one way of doing so, or trying to. Spinoza can allow that God is metaphysically transcendent in the sense I've specified, for he grants a basic ontological distinction between God and everything else. And he spells this out by insisting that substantiality applies only to God. We're just modes of this one substance. Okay. However, and this is how the objection is going, this gives Spinoza the resources only to distinguish between God and the things within the world. And he cannot say that God is distinct from the world as a whole. So maybe John's worry is that being a naturalist, I must deny that God is distinct from the world as a whole, whereas he, the theist, insists upon this distinction. Now, I'm wholly unclear again about what it means to talk of God as being distinct from the world as a whole. For even if we say that it's the distinction which grants us the right to say that God created the world, Spinoza himself can accommodate the idea of a creator God, and he does. On his understanding of creation, to create is to be independent of any other cause, to be self-causing. Nancy Levine, in her book on Spinoza, takes this to involve, quotes, a biblical concept of causation insofar as it maintains an absolute distinction between God and humankind, while insisting that humankind transforms itself into, because it is made from, the divine image. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you find Hegel saying. And here's a quote from Tillich, which is also on your sheet, quoted by John Robinson in Honest to God. The phrase Deus sive natura, used by people like Scotus Erigena and Spinoza, does not say that God is identical with nature, but that he is identical with the natura naturans, the creative nature, the creative ground of all natural objects. In modern naturalism, the religious quality of these affirmations has almost disappeared, especially among philosophizing scientists who understand nature in terms of materialism and mechanism. I agree with Robinson, who, as I've said, cites this passage, that the God rejected by the typical naturalist is God in the suspect supernaturalist sense, God as externally related to the world, God according to this conjunctive framework that I'm wanting to reject. And that talk of a creative ground of things, I agree that talk of a creative ground of things is not invariably atheistic. Hegel would agree. So, I mean, that's just the end of the paper, but I just want to add one more thing. John describes my position as radical immanentism. I would say that his understanding of radical immanentism is not radical enough, and that a truly radical immanentism already accommodates the transcendent, because that is what it means to dispense with the offending dualism as I understand it and as Hegel understands it.